Thanks for staying with us. Back to the Capitol, despite the biennium budget already being passed and Connecticut in a much healthier place financially, this legislative session was all about the money. From frustration over the fiscal guardrails to the last of the COVID-19 federal funding. We've covered the spending struggle extensively, and you can find all that reporting online and on the Fox 61 News app. But this episode, I asked House Speaker Matt Ritter and Senate Minority Leader Stephen Harding, with the session behind them, what were the fears and the successes in this budget battle?
This session was still so much about fiscal guardrails and spending, even though the two-year budget was passed last year. But in this short session, we still talked so much about money, and it's also where we saw a lot of tension this year, not just between chambers and parties, but I think a lot between this building and a lot of organizations and residents who have rallied. They felt like the state had so much extra money, and because of those fiscal guardrails, because of the spending cap, wasn't giving people as much money as they really wanted. So, Senator Harding, you feel, and a lot of Republicans felt, like the budget needed to be reopened this year, right?
Yeah, no, I firmly believe that, and I would make an argument that, you know, the revenue cap is off balance and in deficiency by about $150 million, and so I would argue we have to open up the budget to make those cuts to address that within the revenue cap. And again, these are all things, these fiscal guardrails, that have led us to the financial standpoint that we're in. It has led us to reducing taxes. I think it could lead us to further reducing taxes and putting the money back in the pockets and the pocketbooks of so many individuals throughout our state that are working so hard. And that's one of the things that I hear most from residents when I'm knocking doors, meeting with them, is how costly everything is. Anything that's going to potentially put more cost burden upon them from the state of Connecticut is going to be an economic driver downwards, which we haven't been seeing, fortunately. We've been seeing it upwards. In order to keep it that way, I think the fiscal guardrails are imperative for that.
The Speaker, you were obviously part of conversations to not reopen the budget, to not make any formal budget adjustments this year. Tell me a little bit about what led to that decision, and now that the session's over, if you still think that was the right choice.
It was the right choice because we didn't have to change anything from our biennium budget. We didn't have to change our spending package or our revenue package. The tax cuts we enacted stayed. The earned income tax credits at its highest level of all time. I mentioned education cost sharing, the highest increase in state history, not a dollar touched. The revenue cap that the senator mentioned, yeah, it could be off. We carried about $200 million in surplus from FY24 to FY25. That greatly shrunk that gap. Admittedly, that number jumped $100 million in 1 week. So it is hard sometimes because we get the numbers very, very late in the game. And even as of April, when we got our final revenue numbers, it went from $400 million going to the pension fund to over $1 billion. It jumped almost about $600 million in 1 week. And so in hindsight, I'm glad we didn't reopen the budget because the numbers were so good and positive, we didn't really feel the need to. And it would have required some reductions in some places potentially. And when you have $1 billion surplus, it's hard to explain to the public why you're reducing services. When you talk about next year, right, I've always said this, okay, as someone who was in the room in 2017 when the guardrails were first adopted and was proud of that moment, is we start off with, by putting $1 billion in the pension fund, you already gain $60 to $70 million in spending cap room next year. We recalculate our spending cap every 2 years. It'll probably go up 4 to 5%, something like that, based upon either the rate of inflation or the other standard we have, which is basically, income tested. And at the end of the day, that's going to create probably close to $800 million in room to spend. Some of that is swallowed by current services, which the senator alluded to, that we might have spent this year. But we think between those things, we'll have some room, and then you go from there. But I have read every year it's going to be a budget nightmare. We're never going to get there, but we find a way, and I think we'll do it again next year, too.
You mentioned being there in 2017 when the fiscal guardrails were first put in place. I think most everyone I've spoken with about this agrees that these have led to the place Connecticut is in now, in a very financially healthy place. We saw the fiscal guardrails renewed, but I've also heard from some lawmakers that they think maybe considering reforms next year might be a good idea. Speaker, we'll start with you. What's your response to that?
I think it depends what the reform is. If it's taking money and sort of spending it outside the spending cap for ongoing recurring expenses, that's going to set you for a slippery slope. The one that I've heard the most talk about, right, and maybe the Senator doesn't agree, is the number that we picked for what's known as the volatility cap. And people watching at home are probably like, what are these two talking about? But that number was a pretty arbitrarily picked number. And I've had conversations with Republicans that agree that number may be too low. In other words, how much money goes into the pension fund and the rainy day fund above that number? Could you move that number a little higher? And that would create a couple things, a little more revenue to spend, but also, and potentially, who knows, instead of putting $1 billion in the pension fund, maybe you're putting $800 million. I'd be willing to look at that, but it also depends on what we're using it for, and again, making sure we have that sustainability. The guardrails also expire in 2028. And my message to the governor has been, and to my friend on the right, if you don't make reforms or do something, you do run the risk of the guardrails going away if we're so inflexible that we're cutting nonprofits or we're cutting education cost sharing. So you have to be open-minded or you can lose the whole thing.
And I would say, look, we have to be open-minded, but I really would be extremely cautious in terms, particularly the volatility cap that the speaker mentioned. I understand that that number may be somewhat arbitrary and it has to be revisited. But at the same time, we still have the second highest debt per capita, in the country that we're trying to pay down. We've made record payments towards that. That's undoubtedly the case. However, I would say that considering the amount we have debt, I really would, and the fact that the volatility cap is what is paying down that debt, I'd be extremely cautious about changing the numbers in which less debt may be paid down from that.
My only response to that, though, is if you look at around 2038 and beyond, the pension fund becomes in a much healthier condition, even if we didn't put any additional money in. And that's largely because those very rich benefits that were given to the Tier 1 employees will begin to go away as people, unfortunately, are no longer with us. But the real drain on that system is people who were used to retire with their full salaries and the state putting no money in. It will get better. So you have to ask yourself, what is the goal? Is it to fully fund 100%? Is it to taper off as the benefits themselves come down? I think it's worth a conversation.
So I want to get a little bit now into the American Rescue Plan Act spending plan. Republicans called it a budget. You called it a stabilization bill. We've seen a lot of different names floated around.
Or budget, non-budget.
Exactly. But whatever you want to call it, it's these federal dollars that needed to be allocated this year.
Correct.
The state had about 370 million left over.
Probably more.
Potentially more, and this plan did pass. It did go through to reallocate this money for this year. These are dollars that came through from Capitol Hill during COVID-19. We're seeing COVID not as much of a threat anymore, but we're still seeing a lot of sectors, a lot of organizations, and people who are saying they're still struggling. They say they had needs before the pandemic, and now those needs are even greater. So I know, Speaker, you were already starting to mention before some of what that money went toward. Specifically, we saw a lot for higher education. We saw some for nonprofits. Obviously, not as much as either of those groups wanted. But tell me a little bit first about, who that money was going toward, what they were getting, why that decision was made to send those money to those groups.
Yeah, and the decision was made, by the way, in a bipartisan way. We had 5 Republicans in the House who voted for it. I think 1 or 2 state senators voted for it.
2.
It doesn't mean it was perfect, but it shows you that it wasn't so bad that we couldn't get Republican support for it. Again, higher education consumed about half of the money. Municipal aid was another part. A lot of towns received money. I think that's why some Republicans voted for it down here, was their towns were getting
those
aid.
Individual municipalities.
Yeah, Danbury, for example, did very well. I think their representative on the Republican side voted for it, if I recall correctly. Yeah. And the nonprofits. But, you can vote against it, but at the end of the day, there's going to be people in the nonprofit sector who are going to see a 2.5% increase. And I'm going to tell them I voted for that and I supported that. And so you can argue all you want about whether we should reopen the budget, but I think that wanting that and voting against ARPA, I would not agree with. I would have made my case, but I would have voted for the ARPA allocation because it did nothing bad. Right? It only helped people at that point. And it's fun money that we have to spend by the end of the year.
So I see it a little differently. I understand that many of these investments are good investment. There's some investments, significant investments to UConn, and to higher ed as well. I think there might have been some disagreement on those investments there. I mean, the bigger thing for me is if it's truly a priority, open up the budget and make it a priority within the operational budget. I know that would have been very difficult with this year to abide by the fiscal guardrails to do that, but that would be my argument towards that. There was arguably about $400 million you could argue would be operational expenses that we utilized ARPA for. In addition to that, my vote against it, and many of my colleagues voted against it, was taking projects that were allocated towards ARPA, then shifting it onto the state's credit card. So we had projects that were being funded unilaterally by the federal government, and we were taking those projects, shifting it onto our state credit card. The taxpayers are now paying for that with interest. I mean, so I would say that there's no doubt there's good investments there. There were many positive investments, but how I look at it is from a fiscal standpoint, I don't think it was necessarily fiscally responsible what was done with the ARPA package.
Well, and on the bonding side, just to comment on that, though, we have a bond cap. That's another one of the fiscal guardrails. So, yes, some stuff got moved to bonding, but you're not going to exceed the amount you borrowed beyond the cap. You're probably just replacing other things that you would have bonded. Yeah.
Right. I've heard both of you talk a lot throughout today about time. It's a short session. In the long session, you have to pass the 2-year budget, which is always kind of the biggest deal. In the short session, maybe adjustments to the budget, maybe not. Money's still a topic of conversation, but I think a lot of people toward the end feel like we've run out of time. There just isn't enough time, in fewer than 100 days to get everything done that you want to get done. Connecticut has a short session every other year, as I said, and I know both of you were proud of many things that were able to get through, but obviously a lot didn't. For each of you, I'll start with Senator Harding. I know this is a big question, but do you think the part-time legislature is effective?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think part of the reason why it's so effective is we have lives outside of this building. We understand what it's like to have some struggles and to balance those budgets. We're small business owners. We're attorneys, we're realtors, we're plumbers, we're teachers, we're police officers, we're firefighters. I mean, it is amazing. It's the crossroads of the state. That's ultimately how our government should be operating. I think that's what our founding fathers wanted how this government to operate. So I think the part-time legislature is a good thing. We have lives outside this building, and it's a service. It's supposed to be a public service, and I think every single person in this building, whether you agree with them or you disagree with them on policy, respect the fact that they are serving their communities by coming up here on a routine basis, and I think the part-time government is very effective.
Yeah, lawmakers were saying to me Wednesday night, I think a lot of times for people who don't understand that you all have lives outside of this building, they think, oh, well, summer vacation starts when the gavel hits midnight, but really everyone was saying now we're going back to our real jobs or our other jobs.
I couldn't agree more with Senator Harding. First of all, it also creates deadlines, and deadlines create compromise. If we had an endless legislature, all these bills we talked about, the Democrats or whoever's in charge would just wait it out and say, well, fine, we'll do it next week. There would be no limit. That's Congress's problem. When they have deadlines, like when they have to get the budget done, they do force compromise. The debt ceiling, they got there. Without deadlines, you don't see compromise. And there are people in this building, and I don't want to be disrespectful, they live and breathe it to the point where they can't stay off the Twitter and the Facebook, and they have to criticize people. And I really don't like working with those people. I like people who can go to their kids' games, go to work, care about what they do, but stop attacking people. If politics is 100% your life, you're not my kind of politician.